October 1792. Along the slow-moving Potomac River, a stretch of cleared ground lay scattered with stone, timber, and the early outlines of a foundation. Workers moved quietly in the autumn air, shaping a Queer Creek sandstone into blocks that would form the walls of a structure the nation had not yet learned to imagine. The federal city around them existed mostly as sketches and survey lines, its streets unpaved, its boundaries marked by stakes rather than buildings. And at the centre of this unfinished landscape rose the beginnings of the President's House, a project meant to symbolise stability in a republic still fragile and unresolved. Nothing about the setting suggested permanence. The riverbanks eroded with each season, roads turned to mud after rain. The District of Columbia, newly selected as the nation's capital, had few residents, limited infrastructure, and no identity beyond the aspirations of its planners. Yet the decision to build here reflected a larger ambition, to create a federal city that represented unity after years of regional tension and political negotiation. The President's House was to stand as the architectural anchor of this vision, a building designed not only as a residence but as a statement of national intent. Its foundations carried the weight of uncertainty. The country was young, its institutions untested, its finances strained. The workers shaping stone and clearing ground understood that they were part of an experiment, one that required the labour of free craftsmen, hired hands, and enslaved people, whose names would rarely appear in the written record. Their combined efforts formed the earliest contours of a house that would become inseparable from the American story. But in these first months, the project was simply a construction site on unsettled land. The President's House was a promise, not yet a symbol. To understand how it evolved from foundation trench to national emblem, one must begin with the debates and decisions that determined where the capital would stand, and why this particular stretch of river was chosen to hold the nation's most visible residents. The selection of the site for the President's House began long before the first stone was laid. It emerged from a decade of conflict, negotiation, and uncertainty in the years following the American Revolution. The young nation lacked not only a stable financial system and a unified political identity, but also a permanent capital. Congress moved from city to city, Philadelphia, New York, Annapolis, Trenton, each location serving temporarily, while the government searched for a place that could embody national ideals without favouring any one region. The debate over a permanent capital exposed deep tensions within the country. Northern and southern states differed in economic priorities, demographic patterns, and visions for national development. The placement of the capital held symbolic and practical significance. Whichever region hosted it would gain influence, population growth, and proximity to federal decision-making. The question grew entangled with broader political concerns, turning the issue into one of the first major negotiations of the post-revolutionary era. The resolution came in 1790 through the Residence Act, a carefully crafted compromise brokered in part by Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton sought support for his financial plan, which included the federal assumption of state debts. Southern representatives opposed the plan, fearing it favoured Northern financial interests. Jefferson and James Madison worked with Hamilton to strike an arrangement. In exchange for Southern support of Hamilton's economic proposal, the new federal capital would be located along the Potomac River, within reach of Virginia and Maryland. This compromise shaped the physical and symbolic landscape of the nation. The Potomac site represented geographic balance, central enough to appease northern states, southern enough to satisfy Virginia's political leadership. It also signalled a break from European precedent. Rather than selecting an established commercial centre or historic city, leaders chose largely undeveloped land, allowing the capital to grow alongside the new nation. The surrounding landscape consisted of forests, fields, and small farms. Roads were inconsistent, often impassable in poor weather. Infrastructure was limited. Yet the decision reflected optimism, the belief that a purpose-built capital could strengthen the federal system and project national unity. George Washington, tasked with overseeing the development of the federal district, played a central role in shaping the city's early form. He appointed Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a French-born engineer, to design the layout. L'Enfant envisioned a city of broad avenues, open public squares, and monumental buildings positioned along key sightlines. His plan integrated symbolism into urban design, avenues representing national unity, elevations chosen to emphasize civic authority, and strategic placements of major buildings to articulate institutional relationships. The President's House would occupy a prominent position, set apart from the capital, yet aligned with it through carefully plotted axes. Selecting the precise site for the President's House required balancing practical considerations with L'Enfant's vision. Washington sought elevated ground that offered views of the river, sufficient drainage, and access to transportation routes. The chosen location, situated on a rise north of the Potomac and west of the emerging capital site, met these criteria. From its position, the house would overlook the developing city, asserting the presence of the executive branch without overshadowing legislative authority. The land itself came from parcels owned by prominent local families, many of whom participated in negotiations that blended patriotism with pragmatic self-interest. Property owners donated portions of their land in exchange for the promise of increased value as the city expanded around them. The contours of the future federal district thus grew from a mixture of idealism, negotiation, and economic calculation. Even before construction began, the decision to place the capital here carried ecological implications. The humid climate and marshy terrain posed challenges for health and sanitation. Summers brought intense heat and the spread of mosquito-borne illnesses. Winters produced damp, bone-chilling cold. These conditions shaped the labour environment for the workers who would eventually build the President's House and influence the rhythms of construction. The symbolic meaning of the site grew clearer with time. The new capital was neither northern nor southern, neither urban nor rural. It was a constructed compromise, an engineered centre for a nation still defining itself. Its placement along the Potomac carried historical resonance. The river had long been a corridor of commerce and culture, linking regions and supporting early settlements. By situating the capital here, leaders emphasized geographic connectivity and the idea of a shared national space. But symbolism alone could not build a city. L'Enfant's ambitious design soon collided with financial limitations, political disagreements, and disputes over land use. Conflicts between L'Enfant and property owners, as well as tensions with commissioners overseeing the district, eventually led to his dismissal. His plan, however, continued to guide development, influencing road alignments, building placements, and the orientation of the President's House. As preparations continued, attention turned to the architectural identity of the residence itself. The President's House would need to serve domestic and public functions, symbolizing Republican values while presenting a dignified appearance to foreign dignitaries. The building could not resemble European palaces too closely, yet it needed to convey authority and stability. The challenge was profound. How does a young nation, still fragile in its institutions, define the architecture of its highest office? What style could represent both modest Republican ideals and the permanence required of a national capital? To answer these questions, commissioners announced a design competition in 1792, an open call for architects to propose plans for a structure that would stand at the symbolic heart of the Republic. The entries varied widely, reflecting different visions of what the American presidency should represent. But one design stood out, blending classical influences with clarity, balance, and restraint. It came from a young Irish architect whose work would shape the identity of the executive branch for centuries to come. When the commissioners announced a competition to design the President's House in March 1792, they were not simply seeking plans for a residence. They were asking architects to define what the executive branch should look like in physical form. The young Republic had no architectural tradition for national government buildings. Unlike European nations whose power was expressed through palaces, grand courts, and ornate royal residences, the United States needed a building that projected dignity without monarchy, authority without extravagance. The design had to signal stability to foreign nations while respecting the republican values of a country still wary of centralized power. The competition attracted several submissions, though fewer than the commissioners had hoped. The District of Columbia was not a place where architects could expect professional prestige. It was still a clearing in the woods, its future dependent on political will and uncertain finances. Yet among the entries came a design that balanced practicality with symbolic clarity, a plan submitted by a 33-year-old Irish immigrant named James Hoban. Hoban's background prepared him uniquely for the task. Trained in the classical architectural traditions of Europe, he understood the language of symmetry, proportion, and balance that conveyed civic authority. At the same time, his experience working in the United States had exposed him to the pragmatic constraints of building in a young nation, limited materials, small labour forces, and the need for efficient construction. His proposal for the President's House reflected this dual sensibility, refined but not ostentatious, classical yet achievable, dignified without suggesting aristocratic excess. Holbein drew inspiration from the Leinster House in Dublin and other Palladian structures, adapting their forms for the American context. His design featured a balanced façade, a central pediment, evenly spaced windows, and a rectangular footprint that allowed clear circulation between public and private areas. The interior plans separated ceremonial spaces from living quarters, acknowledging the dual role the residence would play, a home for the president and a stage for the new nation's diplomatic and governmental functions. George Washington, reviewing the submissions, gravitated quickly toward Holbein's design. Washington favoured architectural restraint, forms that conveyed gravitas without unnecessary ornamentation. Holbein's proposal aligned with this preference. It presented the President's House as a structure grounded in classical Republican ideals, emphasizing order, reason, and permanence. Yet the selection of Holbein's plan did not end the design process. Washington, familiar with the practicalities of construction from his plantation management and surveying experience, worked closely with Holbein to refine the proposal. Adjustments were made to strengthen the foundation, enlarge certain rooms, and ensure the building could adapt to future needs. These revisions underscored a key principle of the project. The President's House had to serve not only the immediate presidency, but generations to come. The architectural choices reflected broader cultural tensions. Some leaders wanted a grander, more imposing structure, something rivaling European palaces. Others, wary of monarchy, feared that too much grandeur would contradict Republican values. Holbein's design walked the line between these positions. It expressed authority through proportion rather than decoration, through coherence rather than scale. The white-painted aqueous sandstone, chosen for both aesthetic and economic reasons, provided a unified appearance that reinforced the building's symbolic clarity. Once the design was approved, attention shifted to procurement and logistics. The selected site required grading, drainage planning, and preparation to support heavy materials. Commissioners contracted with quarries in Aquia, Virginia to supply the sandstone blocks that would form the exterior walls. Timber came from regional forests. Ironwork was sourced from local blacksmiths. These decisions reflected the economic realities of the early republic, reliance on nearby resources, regional craftsmen, and simple supply chains. The project's budget presented ongoing challenges. Funds for the capital's construction came from land sales within the District of Columbia, but revenue fluctuated. Financial constraints required constant adjustments to labor schedules, material orders, and construction timelines. The need to balance vision with available resources became a defining characteristic of the early years of building the capital. The President's House began to rise slowly from the prepared foundation. Holbein oversaw the work with methodical care, coordinating teams of masons, carpenters, labourers, and specialised craftsmen. His presence ensured that the design's proportions and structural requirements were maintained despite financial pressures and the difficulties of building in a largely undeveloped region. Washington visited the site periodically, monitoring progress and consulting with Holbein. His involvement reflected the project's symbolic weight. The President's House was not merely a residence for the office holder, but a representation of the executive branch itself. The building needed to project stability even as the political structure it represented remained in formation. The architectural identity of the President's House began taking shape long before it was completed. Its white façade, symmetrical layout, and classical lines signalled a new kind of national architecture, one grounded in Enlightenment ideals rather than aristocratic tradition. Visitors who approached the rising structure in the late 1790s encountered not a palace, but a measured, orderly building that expressed confidence without excess. Yet beneath its walls, the reality of its construction told a more complex story. The labour that shaped the President's House came from diverse hands, free and enslaved, skilled and unskilled, immigrant and American-born. Their combined efforts formed the physical foundation of the executive mansion, even as the nation struggled to define its political and moral identity. To understand how the President's House truly came into being, one must look beyond architectural plans and official documents to the people whose labour made the building possible. The President's House emerged from drawings and political decisions, but its reality depended on the people who shaped stone, cut timber, mixed mortar, and carried materials across the undeveloped grounds of the new capital. Their labour, varied, strenuous, and often unrecorded, formed the true foundation of the building that would later become the White House. Understanding this workforce reveals a deeper story, one in which the ideals of a republic were built by hands that did not share equally in its promises. The labour force that constructed the President's House was diverse but unevenly recognised. It included free white craftsmen, European immigrants, hired labourers, indentured workers, and a significant number of enslaved people whose presence on the site reflected the complex moral contradictions at the heart of the early United States. The President's House was designed to represent national unity, but its construction relied on a divided society's economic and social realities. Enslaved labourers played a central role from the earliest stages. Commissioners overseeing the Capitol's construction leased enslaved workers from Maryland and Virginia owners, paying daily or monthly rates to use their labour. These workers quarried stone, cut timber, hauled materials, and performed the heavy physical tasks necessary for construction. Their labour was often recorded only in brief ledger entries, lists of names, payments made to owners, or tallies of days worked. The records reveal little of their individual experiences, yet their contributions were indispensable. Many enslaved workers brought specialised skills. Some had experience in stone cutting or carpentry. Others served as blacksmiths, sawyers, or plasterers. Their involvement reflects the reality that enslaved labour in the early republic extended far beyond plantation fields, encompassing a wide range of technical crafts. Their work shaped not only the President's House, but also the broader infrastructure of the Capitol, streets, canals, public buildings, making them foundational contributors to the early federal city. Free workers formed another essential component of the workforce. Skilled masons from Scotland and Ireland shaped sandstone blocks with precision, ensuring they fit tightly to create the uniform façade envisioned by James Hoban. Carpenters constructed scaffolding, built interior frames, and fashioned window casings and doorways. Blacksmiths forged nails, hinges, and iron supports. Many of these skilled craftsmen brought techniques rooted in European traditions but adapted them to the constraints of the new environment. Immigrant labourers, particularly Irish workers, performed much of the manual excavation, hauling, and site preparation. They lived in simple structures near the worksite, enduring humid summers, harsh winters, and the challenges of labouring in a developing city without established services. Their wages provided a tenuous foothold in the new republic, but economic instability and fluctuating work schedules often made their circumstances precarious. Indentured servants also appeared in the workforce, bound by contracts that exchanged years of labour for passage to America. Their presence reflected the complex labour landscape of the time, in which freedom and unfreedom coexisted within the same workforce. Alongside them worked hired free black labourers, men who navigated a society marked by racial restrictions, yet found opportunities within construction trades due to the demand for manpower. Coordination among these groups required close oversight. James Hoban, as the supervising architect, maintained a disciplined approach to labour organisation. He assigned tasks based on skill level, managed daily work schedules, and mediated disputes over wages or responsibilities. Hoban's notes reveal an acute awareness of the need to maintain productivity despite unpredictable weather, inconsistent funding, and shortages of materials. The logistics of construction added further complexity. Stone from Aquia Creek had to be quarried, shaped, loaded onto barges, transported downriver, and unloaded at the site. Timber required felling, seasoning, and cutting before it could be shaped into structural beams. Lime for mortar needed to be burned and mixed with sand. These processes demanded continuous labour and careful timing. Delays in quarrying or transport slowed the entire project, placing additional pressure on workers to maintain pace. The physical demands of the work were immense. Quarrying stone required long hours with heavy tools, striking blocks from the cliff face and cutting them to dimension. Hauling loads across uneven ground exposed workers to injuries and exhaustion. Heat and humidity in summer months created harsh conditions, while winter brought cold that stiffened mortar and slowed progress. Despite these challenges, workers maintained steady output, motivated variously by wages, obligations, or coercion. While the President's House was rising, labour conditions reflected broader social inequalities. Enslaved workers received no wages, no legal recognition, and no lasting credit for their contributions. Many free labourers faced irregular pay and economic instability. Skilled craftsmen earned more consistent wages, but worked within a project burdened by fluctuating funding and shifting political priorities. The combination of these conditions shaped the pace and character of the construction, revealing how national identity and labour systems intertwined in the early republic. The workforce also revealed the contradictions of the new capital. The United States proclaimed ideals of liberty and equality, yet the building representing the executive branch relied on the labour of people denied basic rights. Enslaved workers shaped the stones of a house where presidents would later debate the nation's future. Their unacknowledged contributions formed the literal and symbolic infrastructure of the new government. As the walls rose and the structure took shape, the president's house began to transform from a worksite into a symbol. But the building remained incomplete, not only physically, but in its representation of a nation still struggling to reconcile ideals with practice. The workforce that built the mansion embodied this tension, reflecting both the promise and the profound limitations of the young republic. With the workforce in place and materials flowing to the site, the construction of the president's house entered its most visible phase. Stone walls rose, timbers formed the internal skeleton, and rooms began to emerge in the rough outline. To understand how the building took on its familiar form, one must examine the methods and challenges of its construction. By 1793, the president's house began to rise visibly above the cleared ground, its footprint marked out in stone, and its walls slowly climbing toward their intended height. What had started as a vision on parchment now demanded steady, methodical labour, tens of thousands of hours of cutting, lifting, shaping, and assembling. The construction of the building that would become the White House was neither swift nor smooth. It unfolded through a series of incremental gains, each shaped by practical constraints, environmental challenges, and the varied skills of the workers who brought the design to life. The cornerstone was laid on October 13, 1792, in a ceremony that blended symbolic purpose with political necessity. Though much of the city was still sparse and undeveloped, the act of laying the cornerstone affirmed the federal government's commitment to its new capital. From that moment, the president's house was not only an architectural project, it became a public statement of endurance and intent. Construction began with the sandstone blocks quarried from Aquia Creek in Virginia. Enslaved labourers and hired workers extracted the stones using iron wedges and wooden mallets, loosening them from the quarry walls before shaping them into transportable blocks. These stones travelled by barge along the Potomac River, arriving at docks near the building site. Once unloaded, teams of labourers and oxen hauled the heavy blocks across uneven terrain to the foundation, where skilled masons fitted them into place with careful precision. The exterior walls rose slowly, their height increasing season by season. Holborn insisted on strict adherence to his design. Each block required proper alignment, each joint a consistent mortar thickness. The masons' expertise ensured that the walls remained stable as they grew taller. Their work created the symmetrical façade that would later define the building's character, even though at the time it stood isolated amid a landscape of dirt tracks, scattered workshops, and the beginnings of other federal buildings. Building in the District of Columbia presented constant challenges. The humid summers slowed mortar curing and forced workers to adjust their pace. Heavy rains turned the site into mud, delaying transport of stone and timber. Winters brought cold conditions that made certain tasks nearly impossible. The seasonal rhythm shaped the pace of construction, producing bursts of rapid progress followed by periods of unavoidable delay. Despite these obstacles, work continued. Carpenters installed wooden scaffolding that encircled the growing structure, providing access to upper levels. They shaped rafters, beams, and floor joists from timber felled in surrounding forests. The interior framework took form as teams of workers installed joists across wide spans, strengthening the structure against collapse. Floors remained rough. Walls stood unfinished. Yet the internal skeleton of the house, its essential structure, began to emerge. Windows and doorways formed another critical phase. Carpenters crafted frames by hand, ensuring they fit precisely into the masonry. Glazing required delicate handling. Early glass was irregular and fragile, demanding careful installation to avoid cracking. As openings filled with glass, the building started to resemble an inhabited structure, its blank stone walls now animated by reflections of light. While the exterior took shape, interior work progressed more slowly. Plasterers applied rough coats of lime plaster to walls, smoothing surfaces that would eventually receive paint or decorative finishes. Blacksmiths forged essential hardware: hinges, brackets, nails, and locks. Some of the iron fittings were produced on site, others arrived from regional shops. Throughout this process, Hoban monitored the work closely, adjusting details as needed to address structural concerns or material shortages. The quarrying and transport of materials required constant coordination. Sandstone shipments needed regular oversight, as delays at the quarry or along the river could halt construction. Timber had to be cut to precise lengths before transport. Mortar production required a steady supply of lime and sand. Transportation systems, still rudimentary, often slowed or disrupted deliveries. Hoban and the commissioners worked continuously to balance supply and demand, adjusting contracts and reallocating labour to maintain progress. Inside the structure, the division between public and private spaces became clearer as construction advanced. Ceremonial rooms, such as the state dining room and the East Room, were designed on a scale that reflected their intended function, hosting dinners, receptions, and official events. Private quarters were smaller and more practical, intended for the daily life of the president and his family. Yet none of the rooms were fully finished during the 1790s, and many would remain incomplete for years after the building first opened. Budget pressures frequently threatened to slow construction. Funding for the capital depended on land sales within the District of Columbia, and sales were inconsistent. Periods of financial shortfall forced commissioners to reduce labour, postpone material orders, or adjust timelines. Hoban adapted to these limitations by prioritising essential structural work over decorative or secondary features. As a result, the building that eventually housed John Adams in 1800 was structurally sound but far from complete. Still, progress remained steady enough for the building's outline to become visible across the growing federal district. Travellers approaching from the Virginia side of the river could see the rising mansion set against the wooded slopes behind it. Workers and residents of the area began referring to it simply as the President's House, though it would not formally receive the name White House until much later. Even in its unfinished state, the building stood as one of the most prominent features in a city yet to take full shape. As exterior walls reached full height and the roof structure settled into place, the interior remained filled with scaffolding, tools, and dust. Fires burned in makeshift hearths as workers dried plaster or warmed themselves during winter months. Lumber piles filled unfinished rooms, windows were installed, removed, and reinstalled as adjustments were made. The President's House resembled a living site of constant motion, a building approaching habitation, but not yet ready for its intended role. By 1800, the structure was sufficiently complete for occupancy. John Adams became the first president to live in the house, arriving to rooms still unfinished, walls still damp with new plaster, and grounds largely undeveloped. The house provided shelter and symbolic presence, but little else. It was a building in transition, a residence prepared to receive its first family but still far from complete in form or function. To understand how the President's House became a functional seat of government and how it evolved under its first occupant, one must examine the early years of habitation, when the building was tested by daily life, long before it became the polished residence recognised today. When John Adams arrived at the President's House in November 1800, the mansion was still a construction site disguised as a residence. The journey itself reflected the unfinished state of the new capital. Roads into the District of Columbia remained rough, bridges incomplete, and stretches of the route scarcely more than rutted paths through partially cleared land. The emerging city, intended to be the permanent seat of the federal government, was little more than a collection of scattered buildings connected by surveys, not streets. Adams entered the house with a mixture of pride and resignation. As the first president to live in the new capital, he understood the symbolic weight of his presence. Yet the building he encountered was far from ready for the functions it was meant to perform. Rooms lacked paint, furnishings were sparse, and heat was inconsistent. Workers moved in and out daily, completing tasks while the Adams family tried to adapt to their new environment. The mansion looked impressive from a distance, but the interior revealed the realities of a building still far from finished. The East Room, intended to be the largest ceremonial space in the house, remained so incomplete that Abigail Adams used it to dry laundry. The walls stood bare, the floorboards unfinished, and the room echoed with the sounds of ongoing work. Other rooms required constant adaptation. Furnishings that had served previous presidential residences in Philadelphia were repurposed, arranged as best as possible within unfamiliar layouts. Heating proved challenging. Fireplaces smoked or provided inadequate warmth during the cold, damp winter. The mansion's size, designed to symbolize national dignity, made it difficult to maintain even modest comfort. Despite these difficulties, the Adamses approached their role with pragmatism. They hosted formal dinners, received guests, and conducted official business in a space that was still transitioning from construction site to residence. Each event demonstrated the dual nature of the building, a symbol of national aspiration on the exterior and a practical, often improvised environment within. Abigail Adams, known for her meticulous management, oversaw household operations with limited staff and resources, adjusting routines to suit the unfinished surroundings. Adams himself recognized the importance of establishing the President's House as a functioning seat of government. In a letter to Abigail shortly after entering the house, he reflected on its future, writing the now famous line, "May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." His sentiment underscored the symbolic purpose of the residence, even as its unfinished condition revealed the ongoing challenges facing the new republic. Washington, D.C., in 1800 remained largely unsettled. The Capitol building was also incomplete, with portions still under scaffolding. Executive offices were dispersed, and communication across the city required navigating unpaved, often muddy roads. Many government officials lived miles from their workplaces, and seasonal weather frequently disrupted travel. These practical challenges shaped the early experience of governance in the capital, influencing everything from legislative activity to social gatherings. Within the President's House, logistical issues persisted. Water had to be hauled manually, as plumbing systems were rudimentary. Lighting relied on candles and oil lamps, which required constant cleaning and maintenance. The kitchens, located in outbuildings, necessitated long walks between cooking areas and dining spaces. Staff faced demanding physical tasks, navigating steep stairs, long corridors, and drafty rooms. The mansion's design, elegant in concept, translated into daily routines that often felt cumbersome. Despite the functional challenges, the President's House served an important diplomatic role. Foreign ministers and dignitaries visited, assessing the young nation's stability through its emerging capital. The building conveyed a sense of continuity despite its unfinished state. Even in its incomplete form, the President's House symbolized the federal government's commitment to establishing a permanent, dignified center of power. Adams's time in the House was brief. After losing the election of 1800, he prepared to leave the capital. His departure revealed the transitional nature of the residence. Furniture, personal belongings, and household goods had to be transported across uneven terrain, while ongoing construction continued around departing staff and arriving workers. When Thomas Jefferson assumed the presidency in March 1801, he entered a house still evolving, still shaped by scaffolding, and still in need of refinement. Jefferson's arrival marked a shift in the building's development. More architecturally minded than Adams, he possessed a clear vision for how the President's House should function, as both a home and a centre of Republican government. His interest in architecture, landscape design, and practical modifications would transform the mansion and its surroundings during his presidency. But before those changes began, the President's House stood as a symbol of transition. It represented a young nation attempting to establish stability amid uncertainty. The house was not yet the polished residence known today. It was a structure in flux, shaped by imperfect conditions and the pragmatic adjustments of its early occupants. Its unfinished rooms reflected a country still defining its identity and determining how its institutions would operate. When Thomas Jefferson entered the President's House in March 1801, he encountered a building with solid foundations but unfinished character. Jefferson, unlike his predecessors, approached the residence with an architect's eye and a planner's instinct. Where Adams had endured the house as a practical necessity, Jefferson saw it as a project in need of refinement, a structure that could reflect the principles of order, rationality, and Republican simplicity he believed essential to the new nation. Jefferson had long been interested in architecture. His designs for Monticello and the University of Virginia showed his preference for classical forms balanced with functional logic. He disliked unnecessary ornamentation but valued proportion, clarity, and landscapes that harmonized with built structures. The President's House, as he inherited it, offered an opportunity to exercise these principles on a national stage. Inside the mansion, Jefferson found rooms in need of organisation and purpose. The spaces were large and dignified, but lacked the functional coherence necessary for governing. The East Room remained unfinished, its vast dimensions more symbolic than practical. Public and private areas were not clearly defined, leading to awkward circulation during official events. Jefferson began by reorganizing interior spaces to separate ceremonial functions from domestic life. He installed partition walls, reorganized furniture, and introduced new layouts that supported both administrative and social activities. Lighting and ventilation required attention. Early oil lamps and candles produced smoke and soot, accumulating residue on ceilings and walls. Jefferson, aware of advancements in European lighting design, experimented with improved lamp systems to brighten rooms while reducing smoke. He also emphasized natural light, ensuring that draperies and window placements optimized daylight. These changes enhanced both the appearance and usability of the residence. Jefferson's influence extended beyond the interior. He viewed the president's house not as an isolated structure but as part of a larger landscape that required careful planning. Pierre-Charles L'Enfant's original vision had included broad vistas and integrated sightlines across the capital, but implementation had been slow and uneven. Jefferson revived elements of L'Enfant's plan, promoting tree plantings, road alignments, and connections between federal buildings to strengthen the symbolic coherence of the capital. The grounds surrounding the president's house received particular attention. Jefferson introduced botanical elements, planting trees and shrubs that reflected his interest in horticulture. He envisioned the grounds as both a practical garden and a landscape that conveyed Republican moderation. While later administrations would expand and formalize these landscapes, Jefferson's contributions established the early framework for the grounds development. One of his most significant architectural additions was the creation of covered passageways, terraced arcades that connected the main residence to service wings. These wings housed kitchens, stables, and storage areas, enabling staff to move between workspaces and the main house without crossing open ground. Jefferson's arcades improved efficiency and protected staff from weather conditions, demonstrating his tendency to merge practicality with architectural intention. Jefferson also reorganized household operations. He introduced French service customs, refined dining arrangements, and established more structured patterns for official receptions. These changes enhanced the president's house as a diplomatic venue. Foreign ministers and dignitaries found in Jefferson's residence an environment that balanced simplicity with intellectual refinement, a reflection of the administration's values. The president's house during Jefferson's tenure remained modest by European standards, but his improvements strengthened its function as a place where the presidency could operate effectively. The building became both a home and a stage for the Republic's public life, supporting state dinners, legislative discussions, and social gatherings that helped define the political culture of the early capital. Despite these advancements, the residence was still vulnerable. Structural elements required maintenance, and the building's sandstone exterior, soft and porous, weathered quickly in the humid climate. Regular repairs were necessary to address cracking, erosion, and staining. Jefferson, aware of these issues, made efforts to improve drainage and repair masonry, though the underlying material limitations persisted. Jefferson's modifications established a pattern for future presidents. Each administration would inherit a building that required adaptation to meet evolving needs. The president's house was not yet the stable, institutional mansion known today. It was an ongoing project, shaped continuously by practical demands and shifting expectations of the presidency. By the time Jefferson left office in 1809, the house had gained greater coherence in both form and function. The residence now supported the rhythm of governing with increased efficiency. Its interiors reflected intentional organization, its grounds showed early landscape planning, and its infrastructure, though still limited, functioned more reliably. Yet the president's house remained a reflection of the nation it served, ambitious, developing, and vulnerable to external pressures. This vulnerability would soon become unmistakable. Within a few years, the house and the capital itself would be tested by one of the most significant crises of the early republic. The War of 1812 would expose the fragility of the government's physical structures and reveal how thin the line was between national resilience and national risk. By the early 1810s, the president's house had begun to assume the rhythms of an established executive residence. It hosted state dinners, diplomatic meetings, and daily administrative work. It had weathered seasonal challenges and ongoing maintenance issues, but it had also grown into a functional symbol of national government. Yet this growing sense of permanence existed against a backdrop of international tension. The United States had entered the War of 1812, a conflict rooted in maritime disputes, trade restrictions, and broader geopolitical pressures between the young republic and Great Britain. The war reached the capital in 1814. The British, recognizing Washington's symbolic importance, planned an expedition to strike at the heart of the American government. A successful attack would not undermine the nation's military capabilities, but it would deal a psychological blow, demonstrating vulnerability in a city meant to embody national unity. Washington was poorly defended. Much of the federal government still operated in a landscape marked by unfinished streets and scattered development. Local militias lacked training, and coordination among military leaders was uneven. When British forces advanced toward the capital in late August 1814, American resistance collapsed quickly in the Battle of Bladensburg. The defeat left Washington exposed. On August 24th, British troops entered the city. Their objective was narrowly focused: damage the public buildings associated with federal authority. They approached the President's house that evening, finding it empty. President James Madison and his cabinet had evacuated earlier that day, and First Lady Dolly Madison, famous for securing important documents and the portrait of George Washington, had also fled. The house stood silent, its windows dark against the summer night. British soldiers entered through the front doors. They found the dining table set for a formal dinner that the Madisons had planned for that evening. The contrast between the prepared feast and the imminent destruction underscored the suddenness of the city's fall. The troops ate briefly before carrying out their orders. They gathered furniture, books, draperies, and other combustible materials into piles, soaking them with oil and setting them ablaze. Flames spread quickly through the building. The President's house, built of sandstone but filled with wood, plaster, and fabric, burned intensely. The heat shattered windows and weakened interior walls. Structural timbers collapsed as fire consumed floors and ceilings. The glow of the burning mansion illuminated the capital, casting orange reflections against darkened clouds. The destruction was not limited to the President's house. British forces set fire to the Capitol, the Treasury, and other government buildings. Each represented an aspect of federal authority, and their burning symbolized the fragility of the American government's physical centers. The British withdrew the next day, their objectives accomplished. As the fire raged, a storm approached the city. Accounts differ on whether it was a hurricane or a severe thunderstorm, but the winds and rain were significant. The storm extinguished the fires in some areas, but also tore roofs from buildings, uprooted trees, and scattered debris. The President's house, already gutted by flames, suffered additional damage. Its exterior walls remained standing, blackened by smoke, but the interior was ruined. The burning of the President's house revealed the vulnerability of the federal city. The capital, intended to project stability, had succumbed quickly to external threat. For many observers, the destruction raised questions about the viability of Washington as the seat of government. Some members of Congress proposed relocating the capital to a northern city better equipped for defense. The reconstruction of the President's house and other federal buildings was not assured, but the symbolic significance of rebuilding soon became clear. Restoring the President's house would demonstrate national resilience, reaffirming the commitment to the capital and the institutions it housed. Public sentiment grew in favor of reconstruction rather than retreat. The President's house, though damaged, would rise again. James Hoban returned to oversee the rebuilding. His original design provided structural stability that allowed the exterior walls to remain intact despite the fire. Workers cleared debris, removed unstable masonry, and prepared the site for reconstruction. The rebuilding process mirrored the original construction in many ways. Skilled craftsmen, labourers, and enslaved workers performed the essential tasks, shaping stone, mixing mortar, and recreating interior spaces destroyed by the flames. The reconstruction offered an opportunity to improve the building. Hoban strengthened structural elements, refined interior layouts, and addressed weaknesses revealed by the fire. He also added features such as vaulted ceilings in some areas, increasing fire resistance. The exterior was repainted with a new lime-based whitewash, a step that reinforced the building's later association with the name White House. By 1817, the President's House was ready for occupancy once again. President James Monroe moved into a restored residence, its interiors renewed but its walls still bearing the weight of the nation's earlier crises. The building now carried two histories, its original construction and its symbolic reconstruction after the war. These layers reflected the evolving identity of the United States, a nation that had survived conflict and affirmed its commitment to a unified capital. The rebuilding of the President's House set the stage for its continued transformation. As the 19th century progressed, the demands placed on the building grew. The nation expanded, administrative functions increased, and presidential households became more complex. The mansion would undergo further alterations to accommodate new pressures, reflecting the changing role of the presidency itself. When James Monroe entered the reconstructed President's House in 1817, the residence stood as both a restored structure and a renewed symbol. The fire of 1814 had exposed the vulnerabilities of the federal city, yet the building's rebirth signaled a resolve to continue the national project in Washington. The reconstruction, led once again by James Hoban, did more than simply repair damage. It refined the building's architecture, strengthened its infrastructure, and prepared it for the demands of a nation entering a new phase of growth. Hoban approached the reconstruction with the advantage of experience. He knew the building's original weaknesses, understood the environmental challenges of the region, and had developed a practical sense of how the residence must function for presidential families and official duties. The fire, destructive as it was, offered an opportunity to address structural issues, improve the building's durability, and refine interior spaces that had never been fully completed during the original construction. The first priority was stabilizing the surviving exterior walls. Though blackened by smoke and scorched by intense heat, the Aquia sandstone held firm. Workers cleared charred debris from the interior, examining masonry for cracks or weaknesses. In some areas, the heat had caused surface spalling, thin layers of stone flaking away, but the core structure remained secure. Hoban ordered selective repairs and reinforced vulnerable points, ensuring that the building's shell could support the weight of a fully reconstructed interior. As the interior was rebuilt, Hoban incorporated lessons learned from the fire. Wooden beams were replaced with improved framing techniques that reduced the risk of rapid collapse. Ceilings in certain rooms were redesigned with vaulting where possible, increasing structural strength. The rebuilding process also allowed for better integration of early heating systems and ventilation channels, which had been difficult to add during the original hurried construction. Interior finishes received careful attention. Plasterers resurfaced walls, creating smooth surfaces that would support paint, decorative moulding, and furnishings. Carpenters crafted new doors, panelling, and staircases, many of which followed revised designs that reflected evolving tastes and functional needs. The East Room, unfinished for years and devastated by the fire, was rebuilt with greater attention to scale and detail, though full ornamentation would continue intermittently under later administrations. The reconstruction also brought subtle shifts in stylistic direction. While Hoban maintained the classical proportions and balanced symmetry of the original design, the interiors began to reflect influences from contemporary European styles, particularly French neoclassicism. Monroe, who had served as a diplomat in France, favoured elegant, refined interiors that balanced formality with restraint. His administration oversaw the selection of furnishings that reflected these preferences, setting a tone that would influence the mansion's aesthetic identity for decades. The renewed President's House featured improved circulation and clearer separation between public and private areas. Lessons from the early years, when the building's interior had struggled to support official functions, guided these refinements. Jefferson's earlier organizational changes had already strengthened the residence's usability, and the reconstruction built upon these foundations. Public rooms were arranged to support receptions, dinners, and diplomatic events, while private rooms were reorganized to improve domestic comfort. The grounds, still relatively undeveloped, remained a work in progress. The fire had not directly damaged them, but the reconstruction period renewed interest in landscaping. Monroe and subsequent administrations planted trees, improved pathways, and began shaping the approach to the mansion. Those sweeping landscape plans would not fully materialize until later in the century. Financial oversight remained an ongoing concern. Reconstruction stretched existing budgets and required congressional support, but political leaders recognized the symbolic importance of restoring the residence. Funding was approved, though not without debate. Some critics questioned the investment in a city still struggling with infrastructure, while others argued that rebuilding the president's house represented a necessary reaffirmation of national stability. In the end, consensus favoured restoration as a political and cultural imperative. By the time the reconstruction was completed, the president's house stood not only repaired, but enhanced. Monroe's administration hosted the first major public events in the renewed mansion, demonstrating its restored ceremonial capacity. Visitors encountered rooms that were now more refined, more functional, and more representative of a confident federal government emerging from a period of conflict. Yet the building's renewed strength did not insulate it from the pressures of national growth. As the 19th century progressed, the population expanded, the federal government grew more complex, and the expectations placed on the presidency increased. The residence, designed in the 1790s for a small executive staff and modest administrative demands, began to strain under the weight of expanding responsibilities. Successive presidents found themselves adapting the mansion to suit evolving needs. Some introduced new furnishings and stylistic touches. Others made incremental improvements to infrastructure, water systems, lighting, and heating. Each administration left its mark, contributing to an evolving architectural and functional identity. But the most significant changes came from the broader transformation of the nation. As the United States expanded westward, industrialized, and intensified its political and economic systems, the president's house remained a fixed point of reference, a building that had to adapt without losing the symbolic continuity it provided. It served as a setting for debates over federal power, slavery, territorial expansion, and the governance of a rapidly changing society. By the mid-19th century, the mansion had become inseparable from the American political landscape, yet it remained in many ways a structure built for a smaller, simpler government. Its next phase of evolution would reflect the challenges of modernization, increased administrative demands, and the growing visibility of the presidency in national life. By the middle of the 19th century, the president's house stood at a crossroads that mirrored the nation's own uncertain path. It remained an essential symbol, recognizable, dignified, and embedded into the public imagination. But the country around it was expanding far beyond what its designers could have anticipated. The United States grew in population, territory, and political complexity, extending westward, industrializing, and confronting deepening national divisions. The White House, built for a modest executive office and a small staff, now found itself responsible for functions far larger than its original plan had intended. Each passing decade exposed new pressures on its architecture, its systems, and the people who operated it. By the 1820s and 1830s, the building's limitations had become increasingly visible. The residence, though elegant, was never intended to house the growing administrative machinery of a modern democracy. The executive branch had begun to expand in both responsibility and personnel, even though the total number of government employees remained small by later standards. Rooms, originally designed for domestic life, took on dual roles as offices, meeting spaces, and storage areas. The East Room, finally furnished after decades of delay, served as a ceremonial space, a venue for receptions, and at times a makeshift working area. The mansion's scale, once criticized as too grand for a republic, was quickly becoming insufficient. This tension between symbolic grandeur and practical constraint defined the building's mid-century evolution. Presidents and their families adapted the residence to their needs, often improvising solutions to problems of space, infrastructure, and operations. Domestic staff, including many enslaved individuals until the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia in 1862, managed household functions in kitchens and service rooms that lacked efficient ventilation or modern equipment. Wood-burning fireplaces remained the house's primary heat source, requiring constant maintenance and labour. Water had to be manually pumped or carried from wells and cisterns. Even basic sanitation lagged far behind emerging technologies available in more industrialised cities. Despite these ongoing challenges, the mansion maintained a delicate balance between ceremonial roles and daily life. The White House's public functions grew more elaborate as the presidency evolved into a central institution. Large state dinners, holiday receptions, and diplomatic gatherings demanded organisation, staff, and space. The mansion's layout, never fully designed for such events, required continual adjustments. Partitions were installed and removed. Carpets and furnishings were rearranged to accommodate growing crowds. Temporary structures sometimes supplemented the insufficient interiors during large receptions or public events. Presidents also introduced personal touches that shaped the residence's aesthetic and functional character. Andrew Jackson, for example, made significant changes during his tenure in the 1830s, including renovations to the portico and interior decor. Under his administration, the White House became a focal point of political culture, drawing citizens from across the country. Large public receptions, levees as they were known, transformed the residence into a space where the boundaries between leadership and the people grew porous. These events placed new demands on staff, requiring efficient management of food, cleaning and crowd control within an architecture never intended for mass gatherings. Technological changes gradually entered the residence, though often later than in private homes of similar scale. Gas lighting reached the White House in the 1840s, reducing reliance on candles and oil lamps and providing more consistent illumination for evening events. But installing gas lines in a building with thick sandstone walls and wooden framing required delicate coordination. Workers threaded pipes through ceilings and along structural beams, creating a network that had to balance safety with functionality. Gas lighting improved visibility but introduced new maintenance needs, as fixtures required careful adjustment and cleaning. Water infrastructure saw similar gradual improvements. Early indoor plumbing systems appeared during the Polk and Fillmore administrations, bringing limited running water to parts of the house. Yet the system remained rudimentary. Hot water was scarce, and early pipes were prone to leaks and rust. Bathrooms were few, and often functioned poorly by modern standards. Staff still shouldered the majority of labour-intensive tasks involving cleaning and maintenance, working within a building that both symbolised modern governance and lagged behind contemporary domestic technology. The grounds, too, began to evolve. The open, unfinished landscape surrounding the mansion gradually gave way to more intentional planning. Roads were improved, gardens expanded, and pathways formalised. Andrew Jackson built the first stone wall surrounding the grounds, creating a clearer separation between public and private spaces. Later administrations added greenhouses, stables, and other outbuildings that supported household operations. These structures created a complex ecosystem around the mansion, one in which staff managed livestock, tended gardens, and maintained vehicles, all while supporting official events at a moment's notice. Architecturally, the mansion underwent notable changes as well. The north portico, which gives the White House its familiar façade, was completed in 1829 after years of intermittent construction. Its classical columns and balanced proportions strengthened the building's symbolic presence, providing a formal entrance that aligned with the aesthetic ideals of the era. The south portico followed in 1824, enhancing both the building's appearance and its connection to the surrounding landscape. Presidential families brought their own layers of personalization. Dolly Madison's influence lingered long after her departure, as her style set a precedent for social life within the mansion. Later, First Ladies expanded on this tradition, refining the residence's decorative identity. Curtains, carpets, and furnishings reflected contemporary tastes, creating a living museum of evolving American interior design. Yet these changes often masked deeper structural needs, as the aging building required repairs to its masonry, framing, and foundational systems. The greatest test of the mansion's durability came during the Civil War. As the nation fractured, the President's house remained a symbol of continuity. The building took on a new gravity during Abraham Lincoln's presidency. Its halls, once used for receptions and celebrations, now hosted urgent meetings, military briefings, and late-night strategy sessions. Telegraph wires snaked into its offices, connecting Lincoln directly with generals in the field. The mansion's infrastructure strained under the constant activity, but its symbolic power deepened. Daily operations continued alongside national crisis. Staff maintained routines of cleaning, cooking, and service, while aware of the larger conflict shaping the country. The mansion's proximity to the front lines, Washington stood only miles from Confederate territory, added tension to daily life. Fortifications ringed the city, soldiers camped nearby. Yet the building stood firm, a visual anchor for a country testing the limits of its unity. After the war, the White House entered another period of transition. The structure had survived fire, expansion, war, and constant adaptation, but its age was showing. Paint peeled from walls exposed to decades of heat and humidity. Plumbing leaked. Gas fixtures needed modernization. Interior spaces, once sufficient, now strained under the growing administrative demands of the post-war presidency. The building required more than piecemeal upgrades. It needed a comprehensive reinvention. The late 19th century brought new materials, technologies, and expectations. Electricity gradually replaced gas lighting. Updated heating systems improved comfort but required extensive retrofitting. Indoor plumbing expanded, though early systems often malfunctioned. Each innovation layered complexity onto a building already dense with hidden infrastructure. Staff navigated a growing network of pipes, ducts, wires, and service corridors, a maze beneath the ceremonial surface. Throughout this period, the White House remained a place of contrasts. Its public rooms projected elegance and authority, while behind the scenes workers navigated challenges familiar to any aging institution: worn-out materials, outdated systems, and limited space. The mansion stood as a physical reflection of the expanding nation, a structure built for simpler times, adapting continuously to modernity. By the end of the century, the need for transformation had become unmistakable. The presidency had outgrown the mansion's original capacity. Staff numbers had increased. Diplomatic responsibilities had expanded. The White House could no longer rely on incremental improvements. It was becoming clear that the building, like the nation it served, would soon require a fundamental reimagining. By the dawn of the 20th century, the White House stood as a building caught between eras, still dignified in appearance but increasingly strained by the weight of a rapidly modernizing nation. Its exterior remained familiar, a classical structure rooted in the 18th century ideals, but inside the demands of the presidency had outpaced the building's original design. The residence, symbolic of continuity, had become a patchwork of improvised offices, narrow staff corridors, new technologies layered upon old infrastructure, and private quarters squeezed between expanding public functions. The house needed more than maintenance. It needed reinvention. The need became undeniable during Theodore Roosevelt's presidency. By 1901, the White House was overcrowded. The executive staff, now larger due to new federal agencies, administrative responsibilities, and the growing complexities of national leadership, occupied makeshift offices in the second-floor family quarters. Clerks and secretaries worked in rooms never intended for administrative use, while the president's day-to-day activities collided with domestic routines. Children's bedrooms shared walls with meeting rooms. State receptions required rearranging furniture and navigating tight spaces. The building's symbolic role had grown immensely, but its physical structure had not kept pace. Roosevelt commissioned a team of prominent architects led by Charles McKim of McKim, Mead and White to reimagine the residence. The firm approached the project with respect for the original structure, but recognized the need to separate public and administrative functions from the private life of the first family. Their solution was the creation of the West Wing, a new executive office building constructed beside the main residence. The West Wing provided dedicated spaces for clerks, secretaries, advisors, and the president himself, giving the growing executive branch a formal home independent of the family residence. This shift transformed the internal logic of the White House. For the first time, the daily operations of government, the meetings, briefings, memos, and decisions that shaped national policy, occurred in spaces designed specifically for administrative work. The president's private living space regained its domestic character, no longer forced to serve as a makeshift office. This separation of spheres reflected the growing complexity of governance, marking the White House's evolution from a domestic mansion into a hybrid institution, part home, part political nerve center, part national symbol. Inside the residence, McKim's renovations addressed decades of accumulated wear. Rooms were reorganized, mechanical systems replaced or upgraded, and stylistic changes introduced to align the interiors with the principles of classical revival architecture. Electricity, still relatively new, required rewiring the entire building. Heating systems were modernized, though their installation required navigating the thick masonry walls. Plumbing was expanded and standardized. These changes improved comfort and functionality, but also highlighted how deeply the original structure needed adaptation to support modern life. Yet even as the mansion modernized, elements of its past remained embedded within its walls. Behind renovated surfaces lay the physical traces of earlier construction phases: charred timbers from the 1814 fire, hand-split beams from the 1790s, and marks made by enslaved craftsmen whose names never appeared in official records. These traces remained hidden, forgotten by most who occupied the building, yet they formed an unbroken connection between the 18th century workforce and the modern institution that had grown around their labour. As the century progressed, the White House continued to evolve. The West Wing expanded under President William Howard Taft, who added the Oval Office in 1909. Successive administrations refined interior layouts, introduced new technologies, and adapted spaces for shifting needs. Telephones, typewriters, and later radio and film equipment found places within the building, each requiring structural accommodation. The mansion became a technological organism, old walls containing new systems, historical rooms wired with modern capabilities. By the mid-20th century, however, the house faced a deeper structural crisis. Years of renovations combined with the age of the building had weakened its internal frame. By the time Harry Truman took office in 1945, inspectors reported alarming findings: sagging floors, cracked walls, unstable beams, and foundations compromised by decades of shifting weight. In some rooms, floors dipped dangerously underfoot. Engineers described the residence as structurally unsound, still standing, but at risk of collapse. In 1948, the situation reached a turning point. The building's internal supports had deteriorated to such a degree that Truman and his family were relocated across the street to Blair House. What followed was one of the most extensive and controversial renovations in White House history. The entire interior was gutted, leaving only the exterior wall standing. Inside that shell, a new steel frame was constructed, creating a modern structural core capable of supporting the weight and demands of contemporary use. This renovation preserved the building's exterior appearance but transformed its internal anatomy, ensuring its survival into the modern era. The rebuilding also brought to the surface questions about preservation, authenticity, and historical memory. What did it mean for the national symbol to retain its outer shell while replacing its interior? Which aspects of the building represented continuity and which reflected necessary change? The Truman renovation sparked debates that would continue into future decades as preservationists, historians, and the public considered the balance between the White House's symbolic appearance and its practical needs. As the structure stabilized, attention increasingly turned to the stories embedded within its history, particularly those of the workers, especially enslaved laborers, whose contributions had long been overlooked. For most of the building's existence, records of enslaved workers were scattered, incomplete, or minimized in public accounts. Their names, if recorded at all, appeared in ledgers as entries next to payments made to slaveholders. The skills they brought, stone-cutting, carpentry, hauling, plastering, were essential to the building's creation but rarely credited. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, researchers, historians, and descendants began piecing together these fragmented accounts. Papers from the commissioners of the District of Columbia, payroll lists, and construction documents revealed the extent of enslaved labor in building not just the White House, but much of the early federal city. These findings reframed the narrative of the mansion's origins. The White House was not merely an architectural achievement of the early republic. It was also a structure built through systems of unfreedom, reflecting contradictions at the heart of the nation's founding. Public acknowledgement followed gradually. Exhibits, plaques, and educational programs highlighted the contributions of enslaved workers. First ladies from different administrations supported these efforts, ensuring that the history became part of the White House's public interpretation. The building's identity expanded, no longer defined solely by its architectural evolution or by the presidents who lived within it, but also by the lives and labor of those whose work had made the structure possible. As the White House entered the modern era, its role continued to shift. Security concerns reshaped the grounds. New technologies transformed communication and administration. The executive branch expanded into a vast institution, far beyond anything imagined in the 1790s. Yet despite these changes, the White House retained its dual nature: home and workplace, stage and sanctuary, historical artifact and living institution. Behind its formal rooms lay a network of service corridors, mechanical spaces, and staff-only areas that supported daily operations. These hidden zones formed the building's functional backbone: kitchens that produced meals for state dinners, maintenance rooms that housed electrical and water systems, offices where staff coordinated tours and events. The mansion operated through a quiet choreography of workers whose tasks ensured that every public moment appeared seamless. Their labour, largely invisible, echoed the contributions of earlier generations who sustained the building through war, expansion, and reconstruction. Today, the White House stands as a layered artifact, a structure shaped by aspiration, conflict, adaptation, and memory. Its architecture reflects the values and contradictions of a nation that has changed dramatically since the 1790s. Its systems reveal the practical realities of sustaining an institution that must function every day under extraordinary scrutiny. Its history acknowledges both celebrated achievements and previously obscured truths. The mansion remains more than a residence. It is a physical archive of national history, containing stories of presidents, families, workers, crises, celebrations, and transformations. Its walls carry the legacy of those who shaped it: architects, craftsmen, enslaved labourers, domestic staff, engineers, and countless others whose contributions form the building's true foundation. The White House endures because it has continually adapted. It has survived fire, war, structural collapse, political upheaval, and social change. Each generation reshaped it to meet its moment, leaving traces for the next to interpret. In doing so, the mansion has become a reflection of the nation's ongoing journey, a place where memory and power meet, where history lives within architecture, and where the story of the United States continues to unfold, room by room, layer by layer. The White House stands today as more than the sum of its rooms, corridors, and carefully preserved facades. It is a structure shaped by centuries of decisions, some aspirational, some pragmatic, and some deeply contradictory. Beneath its polished interiors lie the layered histories of the workers who built it, the administrations that altered it, and the nation that continually redefined its meaning. Each generation left a trace: a revised room, a strengthened wall, a new wing, a changed purpose. Together, these layers form an architectural record of a country still learning how to balance ideals with realities. The building has survived fire, wartime threat, structural collapse, and the pressures of modern governance. Its endurance is not the product of permanence but adaptation. It has been rebuilt from its foundations, expanded to meet growing responsibilities, and reinterpreted as historical understanding evolved. Yet its physical presence has remained constant enough to anchor the nation's sense of continuity. Through crises and celebrations, the White House has served as a stage where public life unfolds and private decisions shape the course of history. To walk through its rooms is to move through time, through ambitions declared and ambitions restrained, through moments of unity and fracture, through the quiet labour that sustains every visible gesture of state. The building story is not finished. It continues to evolve with each presidency, each restoration, and each new understanding of what the nation requires. The White House remains, as it has always been, a work in progress, an emblem of a country whose identity is still being written, built, rebuilt, and remembered.